Number 3, some variations are passed on to offspring. You guys did Punnett squares last year. You learned about phenotypes coming from genotypes. The way you look on the outside is a direct result of the genetics and DNA that you have on the inside. And because of gametes, that DNA being passed on into sperm and egg, some of those variations may very well be passed on to offspring. Obviously, you have your dominant, your recessive traits. You even learned about codominance and incomplete dominance. So sometimes they're passed on, sometimes they're not. It's all a roll of the dice and chance whether this happens or not. Just like number 4, some variations are helpful, and individuals with helpful variations survive and reproduce better than those without these variations. I always use the example of, again, insects. If you are a lovely little bug that lives in the grass, being flaming hot pink is probably not going to be a helpful variation because you are going to stand out like crazy on the brown and green patches of the soil and grass and be very easy for a predator to pick you off and eat you. And of course, after you've been gobbled up and eaten, you aren't passing your genetics on to anybody. Whereas any like brownish or green colored members of your species are better camouflaged, which would be a helpful variation, is going to allow them to most likely live long enough and hopefully find a mate and possibly pass down their coloring, which was a helpful variation that helped them live and hide and survive onto their offspring. And 5, over time, the offspring of individuals with helpful variations make up more of a population and eventually may become a separate species. So again, we go through all of these. Organisms produce lots of offspring. Amongst all of these offspring and individuals, there are differences and variations amongst them. Some of these variations, these organisms are going to be able to pass on to their offspring. Some of these variations maybe are helpful and maybe help those organisms ensure they pass their genetics onto their offspring. And over time, if these variations continue to maybe be helpful and maybe be passed on from parent to offspring, you maybe might possibly many generations down the line end up with a brand new separate species. Maybe. The picture with the giraffes is kind of illustrating this. You can see the tall giraffes and some short giraffes. And then in picture number 2, there appear to be more tall giraffes because that was the helpful variation that allowed them to eat more leaves and live longer. And then in picture number 3, you see no more short giraffes because that was not a helpful variation. And the helpful variation of tallness kept being passed on to where most of the organisms in that population were tall. So this seems logical. This can be backed up with evidence that we can see in genetics and even with selective breeding that we do now, like certain breeds of cats, breeds of dogs, especially in farming. We can see this actually end up happening. Medicine too, because this is how we end up with antibiotic resistant bacteria and things of that nature. But hopefully you understand why I like natural selection a lot more than just things evolved. This at least gives you a method and a process how this happens, and hopefully it makes a lot more sense. Okay, guys, hopefully you survived part 1. Sorry it was a little lengthy, but we got to get through this somehow. You're almost done with chapter 2, section 1, though, if that makes you feel any better. And there's only 2 sections to this chapter, and section 2 goes by pretty quick. So this slide is super, super, super important because these are 2 words that most people get mixed up. Adaptations and variations are not the same thing. They're closely related to each other, but they're not the same. So please make sure you pay attention to the differences. A variation is any difference among members of the same species. These variations are caused by inherited traits because obviously your DNA is the blueprint for what an organism is going to look like. They are, again, results of mutations in an organism's genes. So think back to last year. You should have learned that in order for us to make more cells and grow and repair ourselves, our DNA also has to divide. Our DNA, in order to do this, must copy itself so that each new cell has an exact replica of the organism's DNA. That way, the cells are able to function properly. However, hopefully, you also learned that our DNA is not perfect in copying itself. Sometimes it leaves out some nucleotides, sometimes it adds some extra ones, and sometimes it even moves them around. So, this is what's going to give us mutations. Now, some of these mutations can cause very big, large changes. Some can cause small changes or no changes at all. Likewise, some mutations can be good, some mutations can be bad, and some mutations can be neither. And over time, as more of these mutations exist in a population, some obviously will prove to be slightly more favorable, and over time, more individuals may inherit those mutations. And this could possibly eventually maybe lead to a new species many generations later if these same mutations keep getting passed on from parent to offspring. Okay, so here we have probably one of the best documented cases of traits being passed from parent to offspring for many generations and it affecting the number of individuals that exhibit a particular phenotype or how they look outwardly in a population. These are the peppered moths. And yes, there are two peppered moths in each picture. So these peppered moths are native to England. And in England, there are many birch trees. That is part of their native habitat. If you don't know what a birch tree looks like, that's going to be the bark shown as the background on the picture on the left. They're very white and have kind of a papery bark. And as you can see, it's very difficult to spot the white peppered moth in that picture. However, the black one stands out very, very well on that white bark. So, obviously, as a predator, you're more likely to eat the black peppered moths, meaning that more white peppered moths are going to exist in the population to continue passing those white genes on from parent to offspring, which is why there were not many black peppered moths and lots and lots and lots of white ones. Should make complete and total perfect sense. However, sorry, my throat's a little scratchy today. Sorry about that, guys. During the British Industrial Revolution, there was no Environmental Protection Agency. There were no bans against pollution. Pollution wasn't necessarily seen as such a big deal or a bad thing. It got to the extent, though, that there was so much soot and smog and pollution in the air, it eventually turned the bark of the birch trees black, like you can see in the picture on the right. Very, very, very big difference between those two images. So naturally, what would you expect to happen here? When you have this white moth now that stands out and the black one that's camouflaged, they've kind of switched roles. As a predator, you're again going to pick off the one that's easier to find. So in this instance, more of the white peppered moths are going to be eaten, and there will be more black peppered moths alive to reproduce and pass their black genes on from parent to offspring. So then you would see them reverse roles, where originally there were high populations of white ones and low of black ones. Now you're seeing high populations of black ones and low populations of white ones. And eventually, as we gained more knowledge and intelligence and started caring more about our environment, they obviously cleaned up their act, and you could see the birch trees returning to their normal white color. So, for a third time now, you see a reversal of which phenotype is going to be dominant in the population. With the trees going back to their white coloring, the white moths are now better camouflaged than the black ones. The black ones are going to start getting picked off again, and there will be a larger number of white moths in the population than black ones. So this is probably, again, one of the best documented examples we have of certain traits being seen as favorable and being passed on from parent to offspring, and that making a larger amount of the population have that favorable trait. Now, notice here, we did not create a new species. These were both the same species of peppered moth. You just had the black version and the white version. So even though we had these traits being passed on in different ratios to each other, we did not create a new species here. That's why I say with making a new species, there's a lot of times and what ifs, and it's completely by chance. You're not guaranteed to just poof new species at any given time. Now we're going to focus on what an adaptation is. So the example that you just had with the peppered moth, when the birch trees were healthy and white, being a white peppered moth is going to be an adaptation. Adaptations are variations that make an organism better suited to its environment. So adaptations are the good variations that help it and benefit it. When it was polluted, then the black coloring would have been an adaptation in that instance. So examples are obviously an organism's color, shape, behavior, or chemical makeup. Color and shape are probably pretty obvious what those mean and how they can be helpful, like camouflage or being small and being quick. Behavior, though, that's going to go back to like the blue-footed booby and its particular mating dance that it does, or the marine iguanas and the colors that it can change, and it's staking off certain territories to help attract a mate. Chemical makeup is going to do more with pheromones, not hormones, but pheromones. It starts with a pH. Those are going to be certain chemicals that organisms emit or release to let others of its species know that it's ready for breeding or trying to attract a mate or lead a mate directly to it. And obviously, ones that are stronger, able to go farther distance, or easier picked up or distinguished from another species are going to be more successful. So again, over time, the genetic makeup of a species might change its appearance due to these adaptations being passed on throughout generations from parent to offspring. But lots of environmental factors can also bring about certain changes. Again, I'll go back to the example with the peppered moss. The birch trees did not just naturally decide that, hey, we're going to turn black. It was human influence on the environment that led them to be coated in that black pollution and soot, and that influenced the population of the peppered moths. Other things are going to be individuals moving into and out of a population, because when you're an individual, you kind of have your genes in you, and when you leave a population, you take them with you, and when you go into a population, you take them with you. So organisms that migrate or break off from different herds or packs to start their own herd or pack, they're constantly shifting gene flow in those populations. And you'll see the words immigration and immigration sound almost exactly the same. Just remember that immigration with an I means they're going into a population, and immigration with an E means the organisms are exiting and going out of a population. So besides environmental factors and organisms moving into and out of, there are even geologic reasons why this would happen. And some geologic features will isolate small numbers of individuals from the rest of the population. We just covered a whole entire unit on earth science. So things like earthquakes, the San Andreas Fault. Most little organisms may not be able to just merely hop across from one side to the other. A bigger example of that is going to be the Grand Canyon. However, that was formed from the Colorado River, which is still flowing through the canyon to this day. We're going to talk about two types of squirrels that live on opposite parts of the Grand Canyon, and I'm fairly certain we can all agree that no little itty bitty simple little squirrel is going to just fling itself from one side of the Grand Canyon to the other. And more than likely, one is not going to use its entire lifetime trying to go around the Grand Canyon to get from one side to the other. They're just going to deal with where they're at and make the most out of their situation. And these are going to be the Alberts and Kaibab squirrels that we talk about. I think I've got a picture of them on the next side. But because of this geographic isolation from each other, over several generations, this species of squirrel has taken on two very different appearances based on their location. And eventually, this could result in them becoming totally different species. Again, they're not. We haven't just randomly poofed magic new species. This is still an ongoing thing. If they keep going this route and keep getting different, it could possibly get to a point where these two are no longer able to breed and produce fertile offspring, and we've achieved a new species. But again, still a lot of what ifs and chance that go into that. So here we have the two squirrels that I mentioned earlier, the Kaibab and Albert squirrel. And as you can see, they look super, super similar with some slight differences between them, like the coloration on their tails. One's a little more gray, one's a little more reddish color. One has more distinct ear tufts, but again, really similar squirrels. And you can look at the picture in the middle, and since this is an aerial shot, I'm pretty sure that you can agree with me that we are not going to have one of these little squirrels running from one location to the other to try to reunite and meet back up with each other. So these are some of the differences between them that have happened over time due to their geographic isolation. But either way, they're both still pretty cute and adorable. Now we'll discuss the speed of evolution. I know this may sound a little contradictory to what I said at the beginning of this chapter, that I'm going to explain evolution as a very, very long, slow, gradual process, because I am more of a fan of the gradualism model, and that is going to be the one based off of Darwin's research. Again, it's stated as a slow, ongoing process by which one species changes into the next. A continuous series of mutations will result in a new species over time. Again, these are like ridiculously, excessively long periods of time. The second idea, or the speed of evolution, is known as punctuated equilibrium, kind of like binomial nomenclature. It's a bit of a mouthful. This is going to be rapid evolution comes about when the mutation of a few genes results in a new species in a short. And notice that short here is in quotation marks because I'm not talking about in the matter of hours or days. This is still going to take a few generations to happen, period of time. And there are intermediate forms of organisms. The reason why there are two speeds of evolution is because, well, we can actually see evidence for both. With organisms like animals that we're used to seeing and we can kind of watch their life cycles, gradualism is going to be the primary mode of evolution for these, because it takes a while to make a new generation. Or humans, it's going to take between 15, usually actually about 15ish years, for them to reach the age in which they can reproduce. Then it takes an additional 9 months on top of that, and some will reach that age of reproduction earlier than others, some will reach it later. But again, that's a 15-year period before you can get a new generation, and we know that most people don't have kids at age 15. They're going to wait till later in life to have children. So then that even widens the gap between generations. Elephants, they can live as long as humans, if not longer, and they are pregnant for almost 2 years. So that's another huge generation gap. So this is why gradualism is typically a model that we observe most. Where we're going to observe something like punctuated equilibrium is going to be with bacteria, where bacteria don't have to get to a certain age to where they're able to reproduce and don't have to worry about attracting a mate. They can just split in half and divide through binary fission. And because of how quickly they divide and replicate themselves, this is where they can get more mutations. And because we're constantly fighting them off with different antibiotics, then that means we're going to see more antibiotic resistant strains in the future. So this is where the short periods of time are most seen, is with organisms like bacteria. And viruses are kind of neither considered dead nor alive, so you can't exactly take flu and COVID-19 into this and try to say that it's evolving. The way viruses incorporate into other organisms' DNA, they get a little wild and crazy and do their own thing, but bacteria is definitely going to be the best example that you can use for punctuated equilibrium. Okay, guys, and with this slide, we've basically reached the end of Chapter 2, Section 1. And all you can see here are some charts kind of showing evolution over time. At the left, you've got gradualism, and you can see it's kind of elongated, where you've got species 1, species 2, species 3. And then on the right, you have punctuated equilibrium, where there's like a mutation, poof, species 1. Mutation, new species 2. Mutation, species 3. Just to kind of give you an example of how this would look timeline-wise. I really miss having you guys in the classroom and hearing some of all your crazy off-the-wall questions, because you're usually pretty good at sparking some good discussions. So pretty please log on and try to use Flipgrid. That way you guys can ask me some questions, because I'm sure a lot of you have a lot of comments and ideas about some of this stuff, and I'd really love to hear them and like have some good discussion with you guys. And I hope you're staying healthy and safe, and we will resume our lessons tomorrow. See you then.